Welcome, everyone. Thank you for attending this Future of Policing Coalition, the first of our event series. I am the president of UB Spy, and along with the GMLA and CLA, we have put on this series for you. I hope you enjoy. Just a little bit about our Future of Policing. It's a student-led coalition with UB Law students and their organizations have created this event series out of a need to have a conversation around policing within our community. With police reform at the front of many discussions in this country, it is clear that there is a varied spectrum of beliefs and opinions. Since our community will play a role in what reform looks like as future lawyers, it is important we educate ourselves, share our individual beliefs and perspectives, and work to engage in a constructive dialogue. The Future Policing Coalition has created an event series for the 2021-2022 school year that will engage and educate the UB community. To kick off the event series, we wanted to have a facilitated discussion on the origins of policing, its history, how we got here, and how we need to move forward. This educational experience will lay the foundation for the event series' future events, which will include leaders in state government, police departments, and the Baltimore community to engage in a meaningful discourse on the future of policing. There will be a continuing discussion on this topic and is very dense and deserves proper attention. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Professor Juros, our moderator for this evening.
Thanks, everybody. And thank you, Caitlin. So I want to be clear, envisioning the future of policing is a massively complex task. The issues involved with the police and what's going on range from police-involved killing to police misconduct and corruption to questions of how do we create safe communities to correct questions of corruption. We all saw the gun trace task force issue here in Baltimore. There is so much here, and we have to understand that this is the beginning of a conversation, so it's going to feel a little bit superficial if you view it only as what we discussed today, but hopefully it's part of a much broader conversation. We'll be talking about things like the ways in which new technology are creating different ways in which the police are constantly surveilling everyone, and how to deal with race discrimination in the system. So that's all to say that this is the beginning, but certainly not the end. I do want to acknowledge the coalition that brought this together. So the Criminal Law Association, the Government and Military Law Association, and UB Students for the Public Interest did an incredible amount of work to try and get this together. I'd ask you to give them a hand. And I also want you to know that they did it in a coalition with a number of UB affinity groups, including the Black Law Students Association, the Latin American Law Students Association, the American Pacific American Law Students Association, UB Disabled Law Students Association, the Immigration Law Association, Law Review, Law Forum, and Diversity Council. All of this was student-led. And the students got together, they developed questions for the panel to grapple with, and I think that's amazing. So while they have credit for that, you should understand how I've been instructed, and it was very firm. All right. My job is to ask these panelists, these wonderful panelists, some questions to keep us on schedule, and otherwise I was told to sit and look pretty. I was also informed that the goal here is for us to start the conversation, but hopefully have a conversation. So we're going to have time for questions. We hope we will be hearing from you. I was also informed by the dean that I will be in big trouble if we go past 6:15. Okay, so in order to keep things moving, we decided collectively to cut down on the introduction. So I'm just going to tell you who these people are. This is Professor Zena Makar, Professor Jose Anderson, and Professor Mike Higginbotham. Thank you. Oh, my God, and I forgot behind it. And the voice and head on the screen is Professor Amy Dillard. Sorry, Amy. Who is looming over us all right? Now, know that the bios are on the website. All of these professors have engaged in the practice of criminal and constitutional law and teach it here at the law school. All right. I'm also pleased to inform you all that all 5 of these professors are affiliated with our new Center for Criminal Justice Reform that was established just recently here at the law school with a generous gift from a donor, Sam Rose, who's an alumni, who established it with the idea that we will support community-driven efforts to improve the criminal legal system and have conversations like the conversation we hope to have tonight about how to reduce systemic inequality and promote justice. All right, with that, I'm going to kick it off with a question for Professor McCarr. And that is, if we want to talk about the future of policing, it's useful for us to understand how we got here. So can you help frame the conversation of race and the police by giving us a historical view of the police and discuss how legal efforts to regulate police misconduct have either been effective or have been undermined?
Right.
It's a big question.
Very big question. Thank you, Professor Jaros. So I think you're right to frame the conversation around the idea that there are many facets to policing and how we understand the future of policing, if there is a future of policing at all. And one of those is because we know that policing is racially discriminatory. It has racially discriminatory roots. And the reason why we know this, or the reason that we come to this understanding, is because we see it in mainstream media, right? We've seen it through the deaths of George Floyd, through Eric Garner, through Breonna Taylor, and through Freddie Gray. We also see it in terms of our local communities, deaths that don't actually make mainstream media, perhaps Karan Hilton or Marquise Alston. We also know by certain studies that Black men are 2.5 times more likely than white men to be killed by police during their lifetime. But that also doesn't necessarily paint the most complete picture, because oftentimes, policing practices are incredibly opaque. They're not transparent. They're often inward looking. And because of that, there isn't very good data on what happens in the day-to-day. Instances that actually don't result in the death of an individual, something that could still be unconstitutional, but may not amount to something that makes mainstream media. So in order to talk about some of the definitional terms and frameworks that you asked me to talk about, you've probably heard about terms such as defund the police, police abolition, qualified immunity. So to essentially establish a framework for you all to think through those concepts, I'm going to go through just a very surface level history of policing. And I think maybe some of you have maybe already know this history, some it may be new to. So in terms of where policing actually began, where did it start? One thing that may surprise some of you is that prior to the Civil War, there was actually no public or central police established. It only came about being after the Civil War. And the North and the South essentially created their own sets of law enforcement that were addressing, in a sense, created to address some sort of social need. So for example, in the North, policing was starting to mimic essentially protection for the purposes of property. This idea that the shipping and trade business needed to be protected at ports. So that's the form that policing started to take in the North. However, in the South, policing actually started to be used, a public centralized police force started to be used to essentially enforce badges of slavery, because those policing institutions were actually modeled after original slave patrols that were created created during the Civil War and out of the Reconstruction era. So I'm going to fast forward now from that kind of really brief overview. There's a lot of nuances there, but fast forwarding now to essentially what the law started to do to combat some of that racially discriminatory foundation that was being created by way of having policing institutions modeled off after slave patrols. So fast forwarding, and in the Civil Rights Act of 1871, you actually see the first instance in which the 1983 Act is being introduced. It's really, really significant because the 1983 Act is intended to be essentially an arm of the 14th Amendment. It was intended to combat some of these racial structures that were established by way of policing practices that became essentially discriminatory. And 1983 was essentially supposed to be a way in which individuals could bring an action against and hold public officials accountable for any kind of constitutional violation or some kind of discriminatory act. So public officials who wouldn't necessarily have absolute immunity, like police officers or police departments. So if we're thinking about these definitional terms now that you're hearing in the media, defund the police, police abolition, qualified immunity, they kind of stem from our original development of policing. So defund the police is actually the movement is really premised on the idea of divesting funds from the police department. And the idea of divesting funds from the police department would mean to shift funds that would go to a police department present day and move them to an area that may have been more appropriate, that was never actually intended to be policed at the inception of a police department's foundation. So the idea of moving funds towards mental and social health services, moving funds towards education, housing, other areas of the law in which, or other areas of society that can better handle traumatic instances, but through a non-violent mechanism. If we're thinking about police abolition, I know that Professor Dillard is going to talk a lot more about police abolition, but just to lay the framework for you and think about it in terms of the history of policing, police abolition is grounded on the idea that policing in and of itself is fundamentally flawed, that it was created on a fundamentally flawed structure, and that structure is just so contaminated in a way that you would not be able to reform the police department because of how contaminated and how flawed the original conception is. So because of that, you need to shift away from the idea of shift away and make reform based on systems of public safety instead. Okay, and I know Professor Dillard might have some more nuances to that and can clarify that for me. How'd I do? All right, pretty good. Okay, so then let me talk a little bit now about the legal aspect of this. So you've heard the term qualified immunity probably come up quite a bit. Qualified immunity, essentially the idea being that it prevents police officers from being held liable for actions that they've, what seems to be unconstitutional actions that they've done to an individual, right? So qualified immunity essentially is a judicially created doctrine. What it does is it interacts directly with Section 1983 that I just mentioned. And what it's doing is it's essentially defanging some of the work that legal advocates had done when they created 1983. This idea that it was supposed to be 1983 being a mechanism to prevent discrimination and have create some teeth for the purposes of the 14th Amendment. So qualified immunity in some way does away with that. It makes it very, very hard to bring any kind of civil action against a police officer because it protects police officers from civil damages. But remember that qualified immunity isn't actually impacting a criminal prosecution. That's a completely different area of the law. This is as it pertains to plaintiffs who bring a suit for some form of police brutality. In terms of qualified immunity, you've also probably heard the term clearly established law. Clearly established law is somewhat of a controversial legal standard. The reason being is that what clearly established law, and I'm kind of simplifying it a little bit, but what it essentially means is that there is some kind of case on point that essentially puts a police officer on notice that what they are doing is unconstitutional. So as you all know from being in law school, it's very hard to actually mimic a particular case fact by fact, right? I see some heads nodding. Yes, yes. So it's very hard to actually find precedent that has the exact same circumstances and the exact same facts in which another plaintiff can point to and say that police officer should have been put on notice and that their actions were unconstitutional. So because of that limitation, it can be often, again, very, very difficult to bring these types of lawsuits because of this very high bar called clearly established law by way of qualified immunity. So I'll wrap up this comment and just say that it might seem that the Supreme Court is very quick to grant qualified immunity. The Supreme Court has more often than not, granted qualified immunity and protected police officers. So what I'm kind of saying, it sounds like what I'm saying, at least if you are someone who is a victim of police brutality, it's all doom and gloom. But what I want to pose to you and suggest is that the importance of understanding the legal doctrine here is really understanding how you can be strategic and how lawyers can be creative in terms of their analysis of the law. So as recently as last month, on October 18th, the Supreme Court issued 2 per curiam opinions, unsigned opinions, in which they overturned lower courts' decisions to deny qualified immunity. But if we look closer at those cases, those were 2 pretty unpublicized cases. But if we look closer at those 2 cases, we can see that in those circumstances, the Supreme Court, while they may have granted qualified immunity, reversing a lower court, they aren't saying that you can't bring a case. They aren't saying that a case needs to be dismissed at its onset. I know probably a bunch of you have taken civil procedure. What the Supreme Court has done in each of these instances has actually assessed qualified immunity at the summary judgment stage. So that's to say that after a motion to dismiss, after discovery, then qualified immunity should be assessed. And this is a particularly important point, and I really want to emphasize this because discovery is incredibly critical to analyzing, in my view, analyzing whether or not or how to initiate and where to begin with regard to reform. Because as I said earlier, police institutions are often very opaque. They're inside looking. It's very difficult to have any sort of transparency and be able to assess what is happening internally within the departments. And that is one of the reasons why reform is so slow to take hold, is because no one, society outside of police departments, no one knows what's happening within. And going through the processes of discovery forces a court to tell a police department, you need to open up your books as it relates to this particular litigation. And any relevant information, depending on the complaint, will potentially lend an opportunity to see what policing practices are existing, what's happening on the inside, and start to assess from there whether or not reform is actually going to happen. How do we actually make some kind of reform happen?
So the way I'm hearing that, though, is while you're optimistic, that it sounds to me like if we think we're going to be able to prevent serious abuse and change the police by suing them, we've got some major legal hurdles to changing the culture or the function of the police just by civil lawsuits.
No, there's definitely significant hurdles in this situation. However, that's not to say that reform can't happen. If we look towards civil rights movements, if we look towards really impactful decisions like Brown versus Board of Education, those didn't happen overnight. It came about through very strategic lawyering, through many, many, many lawsuits and many iterations. And I would suggest that that is essentially how one would have to start to tackle and chip away at qualified immunity, or to really defang what it did to the 14th Amendment. Refang the 14th Amendment.
All right, so I want to move to Jose, and because I think what that brings up is this problem of the law is somewhat limited in our ability to sue police officers when there's been some pretty egregious misconduct. And while clever lawyering can work to undermine that, that's a challenge. In the wake of the death of Freddie Gray here in Baltimore, Jose, and the uprising which followed, the Department of Justice came and did an investigation. And the result of that investigation was a consent decree, which is another way that we can tackle and try and promote reform and change the future policing. So I'm wondering if you could talk to us about the consent decree, how that works, and to some extent, whether you think there are lessons going forward from it.
Okay, so welcome everyone. It's great to see everyone. And I want to thank the student groups for putting this together. You know, sooner than you think, this is going to be your profession. Whatever it's going to be what you decide it's going to be. So it's really great having such proactive students that want to look forward to these important issues. Okay, the consent decree, right? Baltimore City. Their police department is under the control of the feds, right? You know, it's much like my colleague talked about the Civil War and Reconstruction, and really the North bombarded the South and put them under a police state till they knew how to behave themselves, okay? In a way, these are similar themes that we're talking about today. What do you do when the people who are in control don't act according to standards that we can expect in a decent society? Baltimore had a problem, but it wasn't a problem that happened overnight. And indeed, having 7 generations of family here, having grown up with listening to the folklore of Baltimore City, this goes back even when I was a very, very young child, a long time ago. And they had police issues in the city with police behavior. There was a federal court case that involved raids on the minority communities' homes And it was in pursuit of someone who they felt like had assaulted and killed a police officer. And there were two brothers, they were called the Vini brothers, the Vini brother raids. And so what ended up happening was a police officer was shot, one was killed, and then the police spanned out across all of Baltimore City, knocking down the doors of citizens, going at their house, looking for the Vini brothers. Still one of the most outrageous federal cases that you're going to read about police behavior. Baltimore City didn't get better. In fact, they got worse. During times when we say that there was low crime, there was also vigorous policing. 100,000 people arrested in the period that the Department of Justice reviewed. A larger percentage of the arrested were not, nor could they have been charged because there was a Fourth Amendment problem with the arrests. And so finally, the Attorney General of the United States, that job being occupied by Loretta Lynch, landed here at the University of Baltimore in a new building. I'm sure Dean Weiss had something to do with making our accommodations available. I think they took my office chair. I didn't have anywhere to sit. There was so many people here. She brought an army with her to protect the building while she was doing all this stuff. Anyway, I digress. But the point is, the law enforcement mechanism of the country came here to try to settle the way a police force should operate. The local government officials invited them here to both study and deal with the department that in many senses people thought were out of control. Now, let me pause there. Ample criticism of police, but I'm going to take a perspective that if we're going to have police, what should we be doing with police? I've been involved in police training. I worked with lots of officers through the years as a public defender. I've cross-examined many of them. Didn't get too much love there, but we have to do our job. But at the end of the day, I've learned some things about police who join the force for the right reasons and why we might have a problem unless we have the consent decree that helps get us where we should go. Many people that join the police force do it for reasons of wanting to protect the public. There's some who don't, but most do. And what happens is we dampen their enthusiasm because if they don't get the right training early, they're going to be like, the computer, they say bad in, bad out, right? The information that you get. And we don't have enough good sergeants in the police department to lead the younger officers. That has to do with them leaving fast for other jobs or retiring early and going to other stuff. So there has to be incentives for keeping good, professional police mentors in the department. That's a whole nother conversation. We're not ready for that conversation yet because we haven't dealt with basic training of police. How to conduct an investigation, how to de-escalate. And these are some of the things that the consent decree has built in to the reform of the police in Baltimore. Training to say, do you understand the Fourth Amendment? Do you understand the limits of what you can do? Is de-escalation a priority? When is this going to be addressing a mental health issue rather than a criminal issue? And trying to create clear lines, because none of those lines were being observed before the consent decree. Just a couple of points about how some of this works in accord with the consent decree. First of all, the idea that the community is directly connected to policing is something that we have struggled with in this nation. But the best police know that if they have contact in the community, they can do a better job of policing. But it's hard to do, and somebody has to show you how to do it. And there has to be a mindset that police are a servant of the community, literally to protect and serve the community and to become part of the fabric of the community. So we failed at that, and maybe we should return to some older lessons that it has shocked me as I talk to some of the police that I know and that I associate with and golf with, to hear some of the stories of when they were early in their career, what happened. For example, in Baltimore City, you were a sworn officer, but you didn't even get a gun for 6 months. I was shocked to hear that. What do you mean you can get a gun? No, they said, learn how to police without a gun, and we'll give you a gun after that. This is when we had the officers affiliated with neighborhoods and neighborhood districts, where we're also now having an influx of minority officers to the force after years and years and years of civil rights lawsuits, because we were having Black and brown communities policed by white people who were not from the community. And that was a whole separate fight to try to have more people from the community in the police force. And we had some success with that, but that fell off for lots of complicated reasons. And then policing strategies like broken windows policing, and having sort of police being an intimidating force rather than a community servant came in, and people believe that that solved crime. My experience as a public defender, all that does is move crime around. You just chase it around and keep the statistics where you chase it to. And then you say, oh, look at the crime, it's changing, it's moving around. But you don't say it's moving around, you say we're solving it. And you've got these districts competing against each other, and you're counting things based on arrests and numbers and data. And again, that's a dangerous way to approach any problem in the public conversation, by relying on data that supports your conclusion about whether you're thinking you're doing a good job. What happens when you're asking people in the neighborhood? Baltimore has a stop snitching reputation. Actually, that's not totally accurate. It's folklore, but it's not accurate. One of the problems in Baltimore City is that, and my colleague Dave Jarros mentioned earlier, we've had a little problem with police behavior, criminal behavior, gun trace task force. The people in the neighborhood don't know who they can trust in the police department. They're not sure if they tell somebody the information that it's not going right back to the criminal enterprise for which some of these officers were enriching themselves. And that's a big deterrent factor to community cooperation. So before we too harshly judge whether or not people are speaking up to the police, we need to look at the trust infrastructure that has been built for generations in this town. But there is good news. I think that young people who have asked the police to be accountable for how they conduct themselves is the only real spark for change that's going to do any good. At the end of the day, as long as bright people in the community keep asking the questions, what are the police going to do? Who are the police answering to? Are they responding to their job according to the needs of the community? Then it gives the legislature power to make changes that the courts won't do. Courts are not good at enforcing civil rights change at the level we are now. Once you kill Jim Crow, the question is what's going to replace it? That was a immoral system where you could discriminate freely because of these characteristics that nobody actually had any control over. But now that you have the task of how you're going to do it properly, it requires community engagement and continued community engagement. There is good news. The Maryland legislature passed a set of police reform bills that are more aggressive than anything done in the nation in terms of turning back community accountability. But do not be confused. Groundbreaking legislation is not useful if the community doesn't continue to back it and support it and require accountability. Law can begin as a touchstone for change, but it is not the change itself. It's the community saying, I want my police responsive to the needs of the community. And we're doing too much of a us versus them mentality. Are you for the police, or are you for the more progressive thoughts regarding defund the police? It's the wrong question, in my view. I think the right question is, who are the police supposed to serve the community? Let's help them serve the community properly. Let's not be afraid of how they should have done the job right in the first place. my colleague just got through expressing, the history comes from a bad space. Police became adversarial and were more focused on property when they began. They inherited the racism and racist attitudes coming up into the Jim Crow era. And so we never made the police fit the mission that the community requires. And there is good news. You all have the opportunity to rebuild it correctly. And so the legal obstacles notwithstanding, it's really the voice of the community to say, we want our police to be well-trained, thoughtful, obedient of the law, and we will reward their successes according to how they serve our community. And then we have to change the conversation. The consent decree is a tool. We were 4 years without any consent decrees anywhere in the country under a prior administration. So as you all think about the political future of this country, you have to ask yourself the question, are police getting better when we don't have any monitoring of them? I think the answer is evident, but I will leave that question to you. So thank you.
All right, I'm going to jump in there because I think I was worried that we were going to get up here and all agree. And it's more fun when we hear some different views. So I think we're going to hear from Amy, who's going to take a stronger view on reform. But before we get to you, Amy, I'm going to let you get revved up because you also mentioned that there were just some significant reforms. So we're moving along a spectrum here from a consent decree, which is the federal government can make, but well, first, can civil suits change the department? Can federal intervention change the department? And Mike, I'm going to ask you, can you talk to us about what the Maryland Assembly did and talk about whether, well, did that state legislation really change the situation? So can you talk about what's been done and whether that's going to create a different kind of system?
I'm happy to do so, Dave. And I want to thank the students as well for putting on this program. Criminal justice issues in our society today are just so important. They're critical for helping us to get to where I think we want to get to, and that's more justice in our society. The week that we've had today in criminal justice just reaffirms that. We've got the Arbery and the Rittenhouse trials going on. We've got the commutation of a death sentence in Oklahoma for Julius Jones. And Professor Anderson probably is the only one in this room that knows really what that means, because he represented an individual who was on death row here in Maryland, and he got his sentence commuted as well as the first one in 60 years that had been done. And we also have the exoneration of two individuals that were convicted of assassinating Malcolm X. So when you start thinking about criminal justice issues, it's just so important for bringing justice to our society. To get to the specific question, Dave, there is no question in my mind that in looking at the laws that were recently passed here in Maryland dealing with these issues, and I agree with Professor Anderson, what he said. We need good laws, but we also need the empowerment of the community to bring justice and equality to those laws. But we've got some new laws here, and there's a lot of progress when you look at these laws that were passed. You've got independent investigation, a unit in the AG's office that will be investigating use of force by police that results in death in this state. There's no question that the police can't investigate themselves. And so having an independent investigation, I think, is progress. You're also going to be able to get police personnel files now. You couldn't do that before. Now it's going to be like a Freedom of Information Act. You can make a request and get the files of officers and what has been alleged in terms of violations that they may have committed or abuse that they may have committed. There's going to be limits on no-knock warrants. There's going to be limits on surplus military equipment that has been used by officers. There's also some aspects in terms of future effect that some laws won't take effect right immediately, as those that I just mentioned did on October 1st. But you do have some future laws like repeal of law enforcement Bill of Rights. that has protected police officers since 1974. It was the first Bill of Rights for police officers passed in this country, and it provided a great deal of protection even for officers that had committed violations. Setting new standards for the use of force by law enforcement. We're going from a reasonable standard to a more protective of civilian standard that basically means imminent threat of physical harm to police officers before they can use deadly force. And there's increased body cameras that will be used. And also there's a prohibition against filming the police that will be stopped. Civilians filming the police. So to me, there's a lot of helpful things in these laws that have recently been passed and that are or will go into effect in the near future. It's long overdue, and I give a lot of credit. I applaud the General Assembly here in Maryland for especially for overriding the governor's veto. 3 times they overrode the governor's veto. So I applaud the General Assembly for that. But as Professor Anderson also mentioned, let's not get it twisted. Let's not be confused at all. Progress does not mean accountability. Progress does not mean accountability. There are still tremendous problems in ensuring justice. Local prosecutors, not the independent commission, not the independent counsel, still have the power to determine whether criminal indictments will be brought. Civilians now have a role in police discipline, but the police still have the final say on whether who gets fired and who gets reprimanded. There's no national database that we have to identify problem officers and stop them from moving from state to state. And most important, we're not sure how this new, more protective of civilian standard will be interpreted by the courts, will be interpreted by juries. So why is this accountability so important? Because as the federal judge Carlton Reeves said on August 4th, 2020, in a decision that he rendered on police brutality and the protection of police officers. And I quote, Judge Reeves said, in this case, it's Jamison versus McClendon. Judge Reeves said, Clarence Jamison wasn't jaywalking. That was Michael Brown. Clarence Jamison wasn't outside playing with a toy gun. That was 12-year-old Tamir Rice. Clarence Jamison didn't look like a suspicious person. That was Elijah McClain. Clarence Jamison wasn't suspected of selling loose, untaxed cigarettes. That was Eric Garner. Clarence Jamison wasn't suspected of passing a Confederate $20 bill. That was George Floyd. Unfortunately, I could go on for 30 or 40 minutes with a list like this. But the good news is Clarence Jamison is not dead, and all of the others I mentioned are. Why is this accountability so important? Because we want to ensure that when individuals encounter the police, that there's more protection today against bodily harm. And when things go wrong, that there's more justice in the aftermath of those encounters.
Thanks. Amy, I want to turn to you because when we talk about the consent decree, when we talk about suing and qualified immunity, some might say we're just working at the edges of the problem, and a problem that's sustained and maybe even fundamental. So you call yourself an abolitionist, and I'd love to hear sort of what you think that term means and how we could make that a realistic solution that that can be achieved.
Okay. I want to thank you all for putting this together and letting us have this conversation. I want to start by saying that probably everybody on the stage, I know that I am, we're all the beneficiaries of pragmatic incrementalism, whether in race reform or gender reform or gay rights. You know, I have the job I have because of the women's movement. I have the children I have because of the gay rights movement. And I think that there is a lot to be said for pragmatic incrementalism. You know, we celebrate Justice Ginsburg, who was the master of it. I have been a participant in pragmatic incrementalism for 30 years, sorry. Starting as a public defender, then more specifically as a capital defender for the last 20 years. And then in the last 10 years, in serving on 2 different independent police review panels. And I find myself now thinking that, as Justice Blackmun said in '94, I've been tinkering with the machinery of death. Whether it's death in every case or not, I've been tinkering with the machinery of death. And I don't find myself very satisfied in that role anymore. I'm happy to train people to continue to tinker in the machinery, and I think we have to tinker in the machinery. And I want people to know how to do that. But I want to remind you that in 2002, if somebody had said the death penalty was going to be abolished in Virginia in 19 years, everybody would have laughed. I was at those trainings. I was there when the Capital Defender Office was opened. I was handed a capital case in 2002. We all did the work and did the incremental work. But if you had said, do you think this will result in abolition? We would have not been able to believe it. We wanted to believe it. But I do think that that work from the other side, that is from the more radical side, is fundamental. And I think that framing conversations where the goal is clear is helpful. I think a goal of abolishing policing is a terrific goal. And I think it's a terrific goal because I think policing as we know it is that corrupt, that flawed, that racist, that misogynistic, that transphobic, that prosecutor privileged, that interested in caging people and killing people. And that's the core. Those are the core values of the criminal justice system. If I frame it that way, then I can say abolition is the goal for me. And I think abolition is the goal for a lot of people. How do we get there? Well, we know how we get there. We get there by funding and supporting other necessary supports in the community. So folks who come out of education say we would go there. Folks who come out of mental health side of things would say we fund there. Folks who come out of more social services, housing. How do we make sure everybody's got enough food? How do we make sure that everybody has the job that they need? How do we make sure everyone has the childcare that they need, right? If we're putting our resources in different places, we may get to a place where we abolish the need for needing the police. And if we could get there, I would be a much happier person. So when I hear people talk about the abolition movement or the defund movement, I look at my own experience. I look at participating in an independent review panel for a death in custody in Baltimore, for the death in custody before Freddie Gray, for Tyrone West, you know, the name we don't remember, but the name we don't think about. but he was killed exactly like George Floyd was killed. And even the medical examiner, same medical examiner who testified on behalf of the defense in George Floyd's case, we didn't get anything done in that independent review panel. We didn't get anything done because we didn't have any power to get anything done. We made lots of recommendations. We wrote a very nice report. We gave a lot of suggestions to the police department, but we didn't have any power to really reform anything. Sitting on the police review, civilian review panel in Fairfax County, Virginia, a much larger panel. I think there were 60 of us who sat on that commission together. You know, a year and a half of meetings and subcommittee meetings. What we came up with was, well, we need a civilian review panel, but we don't know how it would get funded. We don't know where it would be situated. Would it be situated in the prosecutor's office, in the police department, somewhere else? Literally, where would the office be? What would the power be? You know, we run into so many questions that keep reform slow. I think that folks who are doing reform work can and should continue to do reform work. I think it is a path. But I think another path is having serious questions from the other end of the spectrum. What does it look like if we don't have a police department at all?
Thank you. Now, we're law professors, so we love to talk and we could probably keep talking. But what I'd like to do is move it to questions from the audience and comments from the audience and allow the panelists to respond. So if you have them, we've got microphones and I believe we have a chat. So if not, we'll just keep talking because we can do that. And no, Fernando, no questions about the memo. Anybody have any questions? Brave first soul.
Am I tall enough for this? Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Some of you know I'm in a dual degree program with JD and a master's in negotiation and conflict management within the College of Public Affairs. A student, a colleague of mine, I guess, in that program started a program called Voices of 21217, which is a zip code in Baltimore. And the point of that program was to allow children in that zip code to tell their stories. What we study in conflict management and even in law is just a lot of narratives, right? Telling the story. So my professor got involved to bring that Voices of 21217 program to the police department, or is trying to anyway, with the police training program we have here. My question is, what can University of Baltimore, especially with its connection with the police department, literally being on campus, or police, you know, new cadets, and with the new center that we're starting with the criminal justice reform, what kind of partnerships do you see happening that are that could lead to action when it comes to hearing all perspectives and respecting narratives?
I'm going to steal a little bit of that question and say that's fabulous. And that's actually precisely the kind of role that I think our new center's hoping to play, which is to be a place that is not an academic institution that's just saying, we're going to tell everyone what they should do, but rather a place where we can bring different stakeholders together and bring members of the community together and give them a place and literally even a physical space where they could kind of have that conversation in a safe and productive way. So I'd love to learn more about that specific program, but that's precisely, I think, the kind of work the center wants to support. And I think that's also the kind of program that actually is capable of having a real impact. One of the things that is interesting about policing is a small thing, but it's the way the job is advertised. It's advertised, if you ever look at advertisements to become a police officer, and it's the warrior mentality, and it's like leaping over cars and fighting drug dealers, and it's super exciting. And it portrays the job and the people in the community who are being policed in a particular way. And a program like that changes the narrative and changes the narrative for the police officers of how to view the community and how to view themselves in a way that I think could be particularly productive. You want to chime in?
Yeah, first of all, I just want to say this, in my colleague, Amy Dillard, who actually had been in the vineyards of the hardest part of this work for many years. I have great respect for that. And in some ways, I should be required to answer the pragmatic incrementalism which he raises. And it's possible to say that that has failed to bring enough change for us to justify continuing with that strategy only. It is a fair point she makes. But I will tell you this, if it has any value to change anything, something like the voices of the affected children is the raw material that will cause change if it can work at all. And so my approach, in my view, is to say, there are public hearings for the consent decree. There's a consent decree team that has public hearings. I would take this to every public hearing that they had. I would put on the record that you want the police trained in this. I would batter down their door with giving you a good reason why the voices of affected children can't be heard in this, because it was the voice of affected children that brought about Brown versus Board of Education. And the truth of the matter is, if we don't start with fixing what's wrong for the children, we're finished anyway. So I encourage you to keep that conversation about affected children in the forefront of these conversations about change. I think it's an exciting thing. I think you don't have to back away at all, and maybe perhaps it can show and bear some fruit because those are the right kind of stories. So thank you for that work. And I'd be happy to talk with you about specific people to talk to and where to leave this at the door of specific actors in this process, because I should have been aware that the voices of children were available as a battering ram against these injustices. And so I'd be happy to hear from you about this. Thank you.
You want to speak, Professor Higginbotham?
Oh, Mike, you have something?
Yeah, I
Sure,
did
Jeff.
have, thank you. I agree with the sentiments of my colleague, Professor Dillard, in that I hope that one day, and I hope it's sooner rather than later, that I can see a time when we don't need police officers in this country. That'd be wonderful. But candidly, my own sense is, and I agree with my colleague, Professor McCarr, that this history of policing is based on racism and other discriminations. But it's my hope, and I grew up in LA during the 70s and 80s when you had the worst police minority community relations in the country. I mean, this is a place that they took pride in the chokehold being used against minorities. The racial profile was something that they claimed they created. And when you ran from the police and they apprehended you, everybody knew that you would get a beating before you got to the police station. And all you got to do is look at the film that was shown on Rodney King to understand that that was the practice. But it's my hope that we can change that it doesn't have to be a situation where that's what the police are about. The police can be about what's on their vehicles to protect and serve. The police can be about bringing justice, enforcing justice in the community. And so it's my hope that if we don't get to that society where we don't need the police, that the police are reformed and changed so that it helps us get to that place where they're no longer needed.
First of all, I want to thank you all just for being part of this panel and just providing the information and knowledge of your expertise. I actually wanted to tell Professor Dillard, thank you for being part of that independent review study. Tyrone West was my cousin. So I'm part of the West family. And this is actually what motivated me to come to law school. So my question is, as a law student who's also personally affected by this issue, what can I do to be more active in the reform that we are talking about today?
Amy, do you want to start that off?
I mean, I'll start like I always do when I talk to anybody in the West family, which is to apologize. Because I think that independent review panel failed you and failed him. And I don't think we had the power to do much, but I still wish I had done more with the power that I was given. And I think it motivates me to want to speak more stridently than I used to. And I encourage people to speak more stridently. I think that making sure that we say that we are confronting a system that is not only racist, but is misogynistic, right? I mean, let's think about how many rape kits haven't been tested in Detroit. Let's think about what it looked like when we watched Christine Blasey Ford sitting in front of Congress, right? Let's think about what that case would have looked like if it had been investigated in the mid-'80s. As somebody who was the same age that she was, I can tell you it wouldn't have been pretty. That's my experience with the system. I think that we have to speak stridently about this. I think we have to call it what it is. It's not just that it is in the history of being in the slave patrols. It is that portraits of Robert E. Lee are hanging in police departments all over Virginia and all over the South. We are not 100 and some odd years away from that. People are living in that today, and we need to say that, and we need to say it publicly. And I'm with Jose Ornitza. I love hearing about the children's voice. We got to beat the doors and make these voices heard. And so my suggestion is always the same. Anybody that I've taught recently knows it, right? You need to be the best damn lawyer you know how to be if you're going to work in this system. Whether you're going to prosecute or you're going to defend, you need to be the best damn lawyer you can be. And you need to make sure that you don't get caught up in that system and think that's the only way to reform it, because I think it can and should be reformed politically.
Yeah, I'll just add that in my experience representing victims of families who are affected, one thing that I've noticed and one thing that I've learned from those families is to give yourself grace, because everybody is grieving very differently, and you can grieve through activism, you can grieve through silence. And I think that in terms of your ability to, take action or do what you want, one of the hardest parts about challenging police brutality is the statute of limitations, because oftentimes it's a very short period. In many jurisdictions, it's only 2 years, and that's 2 years for a murder. Whereas if someone else committed a murder, that statute of limitations doesn't exist, right? But for police officers, it's a 2-year statute of limitation for an individual to bring a complaint. So that in and of itself is extremely difficult for families to have to overcome, because that requires you to get your things together, get your affairs in order in some capacity, and be able to bring a lawsuit within 2 years. And that's an incredibly difficult thing to ask anyone to do. So what I would suggest is that, if there are days that you want to be incredibly active and speak out loud on a public platform, you should do that. But if there are days that you cannot do that, that is perfectly appropriate. So rely on your community, rely on coalitions, and rely on your family, because it's not going to be done overnight, and it's certainly not going to be done by one individual.
So you've done the most important thing at all. You made yourself available to get the training to come here to say that you want to use your power. We all have a great deal of power, but we have to figure out the different ways that it's useful. You know, some people talk about run for office and make change. University of Baltimore has had a great tradition of people who have found themselves involved in the legislative process, not as elected people, but as government relations specialists. Y'all think that's a dirty word, lobbyists, right? It's the one you hear. Actually, the truth of the matter is that these government relations specialists are some of the most powerful people in the lawmaking business. And the first thing you can do is you can start to affiliate yourself with them and their coalitions. I'm from the West family. I'm not going away. I've got the street cred to say I lost somebody and the system failed. I've heard my colleague Amy Dillard talk about making herself available for that panel and the frustration it caused her. You know, this stuff, it makes you physically ill when you're trying to make change and injustice, right? It should make us ill. We shouldn't be able to even hold it in our organism, right? When we see injustice, that's the right tone for fighting injustice. But we can be shrewd. We can build our coalitions. We can stay aggressive on those narrow principles that we say, this is non-negotiable, right? It's non-negotiable to continue to ignore unjustified police violence that results in death. We can't agree with that. We should be able to all agree with that. There is no moral argument to disagree with that. And so you say, we're going to dispense with people who say, just let everybody do what they want. Because what does the rule of law mean if it has no basis in humanity? But humanity has an architecture, and you got to work within that architecture as well as raise your activist voice. You're not confined to one skill set. You're not confined to one gift, and you're not confined to one community. And so I just think that having a law school available here with a public policy school with roots in the community, we can make change before people can see it coming if the communities hold together and move forward. And it's still hard work and it's still tough to do, but it's worth doing. And so my view is that you're already on the track, but you kind of keep going at it. Sort of like with the Ravens, move those chains, right? And so this is how we make change. But sometimes it needs a spearhead, right? It needs a point. And then the coalitions build behind it. So just excited about the journey that you're already taking, and don't quit on it.
Thank you. Thank you for the question as well. Over here.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for coming today. My name is Ashlyn. I'm a 2 out here. And I just have a quick question. With your knowledge and expertise, and also moral values too, it all goes for all the panelists. How fair do you think that it is that the consent decree allowed the training academy to train here on our campus? I mean, it's taken away from parking spaces, which seems very minimal, but can be very important. And also other campus spaces that students still pay for to this day. Like, what is your input on that? And do you think that it's fair? Thank you.
I can't speak to the administrative decision, but like a lot of decisions involving police and spending and how many resources are devoted to it, you know, it's a business decision of the people that have the power to do it. And in some ways, working inside the system and outside the system is a useful conversation. If there's a concern about the police being on campus, then that's an opportunity for a conversation about accountability. We might not be able to remove them from the campus, but again, maybe you need to get together with the children of the begotten zip code that is also forgotten, is to say, hey, you know what, maybe if you're here in the community, being part of the community, maybe somebody should give me a good reason why every cadet class shouldn't hear from the children. Do we have an hour for that? You find out from the Baltimore City government relations specialist, and you call up and say, hey, we want the police academy to do this. Can we have a conversation? You put pressure from the outside in, and you have everybody with the power to look you in your face and to tell you no to a simple question they have no counter argument to. And this is the only way to choke these issues to where they need to go. Not always by saying we need to eliminate this thing, but also say what do we get for what we want to do? Because we have a strong disagreement about this, we should get something in the conversation. Now, again, that's some of that pragmatic incrementalism, which sometimes leaves us disappointed and unsatisfied. And I got to tell you that there have been moments in my career, particularly in the death penalty work that me and Amy have done, that a few activists handcuffed to something do come in handy from time to time. I'm not gonna lie about that. So maybe some of those.
I'm gonna be
should
that
better.
person from now on.
I'm gonna get one quick answer to you, Ashlyn, which is not gonna be, obviously when you said moral, I was like, well, you're not talking to me. But I think it actually speaks to some fundamental issues that we deal with here. First of all, it's not the loss of parking spaces. It's the fact that some people don't feel safe when they see a bunch of police officers. It speaks to a much deeper, more fundamental problem. And how do we grapple with that? And I want to respect and acknowledge that that is a very real reaction to having the police academy right here on campus. There is also a fundamental tension, and it's a tension that's sort of between the consent decree and the defund movement, which is when we talk about incremental change, usually we're talking about we want to train police officers. When they don't deal with a mentally ill individual on the street and instead violently arrest them instead of recognizing that they're in crisis, we say they need to be trained better. So there's a part of me that sort of is torn with the degree to which this is an institution that I think is causing great harm here in Baltimore. And the flip side of that, which is the academy is the one place that I would actually like to thrive and improve. And so if there's a role that the university can play in actually training and improving the department, even if we are moving eventually to a place where we provide all kinds of resources so that they're not necessary, I think that's a good thing. So I think we have to sort of weigh that tension. And we have one more question. This is going to be our last one.
Hi, my name is Shamira Upshur, and I'm asking a question from the chat. So for reform to work, would it have to impose a nationwide system of protocol or training? And if it was a nationwide system of training, would it run into issues of federalism?
Great question. So I'm going to make this quick. I think federalizing police training would be absolutely necessary to really get results if the police architecture is going to survive in its current state. You can't have 2,400 counties running different training on different value systems. So that would be an idealistic goal that I think would be very helpful, but it does run into federalism issues, practical implementation issues, and just plain resistance of stubborn places. And we're seeing that now. I mean, if we can't get people to do the simplest stuff, you know, how are we going to get them to do this, which actually might save lives, right? To have uniform training. But I agree with your focused sentiment or the chat question, focused sentiment about should we have uniform standards? I mean, we have them for electricians, plumbers, we have them for airline pilots. But for the people who most affect our liberty, we say, well, you can't do this. You can't make us do stuff. I want my pilot doing the same stuff. So my plane lands okay. That's fine.
Any of the other want to chime in, Zita?
I'll just chime in briefly to say that it's definitely a move in the right direction, because if you think about having a unified central area in which one would be proactively identifying policing practices that need reform. It's the idea that's being premised on proactive reform, right? It's not reactionary reform, because the majority of reform that we see, especially at police departments right now, is reactionary reform. Reactionary in the sense that it comes out of movements. You only saw the ban of the chokehold in many states after what happened to George Floyd. You're only seeing changes in terms of the requirement of body camera footage after there was an instance in which body camera footage was not available. So you're only seeing it after the fact in response to something. And then it makes it feel like legislatures have done their job, right? They've done one thing and it's on the books and now we can move on. But that's not the case. And that's not how policing works, right? We've seen the problem. It shifts around in so many different ways. And having a uniform board or a uniform mechanism to review policing practices would provide a lot of oversight and have this ability to be proactive and remedy issues before they result in someone's death.
And that add one other thing, which is you can get around a lot of federalism by attaching things to money that comes from the government. So there are ways in which you can make certain protocols contingent upon receiving federal funds. The other thing, and a major problem in policing, is we have the problem of the wandering bad cop, where a police officer commits some sort of misconduct, gets fired, and then just gets a job in a neighboring jurisdiction. So related to this question of whether or not there should be national protocols, is the question is whether or not there should be some kind of national registry that keeps track of police officers who lose their job in one place because of misconduct, so that they can't just move to another jurisdiction. We are at 6:13 and I get hurt if we get to 6:15. So I want to thank our panelists very much and thank you all for being so patient, and let's keep that conversation going.
Yes, thank you to all of our panelists and thank you for moderating Professor Jaros. I don't want to get him in trouble. Just a few quick things. The Student Bar Association has graciously provided some grab and go snacks. As we know, we have to eat outside. Feel free to grab that. I think a few professors may mingle, a few have to run out so they don't get fired, but they all do work here. So feel free. I'm sure they would love to talk to you about this conversation again, and also keep a lookout for our future events in the spring. Thanks for coming and have a great I'm ready for the semester to end. Rest of your semester.
Thank you.